Hi, boys and girls. I'm back with another great book. This is The Indian in the Cupboard, and it's a wonderful old tale that I heard many years ago when I was a little girl about your age. My mother used to read this book to myself and my siblings, and I really enjoyed the book because I always felt like I could picture exactly what was happening in the book inside of my mind. So as we read it, I want you to try to make good images of what's happening in the story inside of your mind. So the first chapter is chapter 1, and it's called Birthday Presents. It was not that Omri didn't appreciate Patrick's birthday present to him. Far from it. He was really very grateful. Sort of. It was without a doubt very kind of Patrick to give Omri anything at all, let alone a second-hand plastic Indian that he himself had finished with. The trouble was, though, that Omri was getting a little fed up with small plastic figures. He had loads of those toys. He had biscuit tins full of them, probably 3 or 4 tins, if they were ever put away at the same time, which they never were because most of the time they were scattered about in his bathroom, the loft, the kitchen, the bathroom, not to mention Omri's bedroom and even in the garden. The compost heap, which is a new vocabulary term for you, compost heap, was full of soldiers, which over several autumns had been raked up with the leaves by Omri's mother. They were rather careless about such things. Omri and Patrick had spent many hours together playing with their joint collection of plastic toys, but now they'd had about enough of them, at least for the moment, and that was why when Patrick brought his present to school on Omri's birthday, Omri was disappointed. He tried not to show it, but he was. "Do you really like him?" asked Patrick as Omri stood silently, holding the Indian in his hand. Boys and girls, I think somewhere around here I actually have a little plastic Indian. Here it is. So Omri received this little plastic Indian from his friend, but his friend was done playing with it. "Yes, he's fantastic," said Omri with a very flat voice. "I haven't got an Indian." "I know," said Patrick. "I haven't got any cowboys either." "Nor have I," said Patrick. "That's why I couldn't play with him." Omri opened his mouth to say I wouldn't be able to either, but he didn't want to hurt Patrick's feelings, so he said nothing, and he put Indian in his pocket. Now my Indian isn't quite small enough to fit in my pocket, but he tucked him away. After school, there was a family tea and all the excitement of his presents from his parents and his 2 older brothers. He got his dearest wish, a skateboard complete with a kickboard and a kryptonic wheels from his mom and his dad. And from his oldest brother, Adele, he got a helmet. And Gillen, his other brother, hadn't bought him anything because he had no money. His pocket money had been stopped some time ago in connection with a very unfortunate accident involving his father's bicycle. So when Gillen's turn came to give Omri a present, Omri was very surprised when there was a very large parcel put before him, untidily wrapped in brown paper with string. "What is it?" he asked. "Have a look. I found it in the alley." The alley was a narrow passage that ran along the bottom of the garden where the dust bins stood. The 3 boys used to play there sometimes, and occasionally they found treasures that other, perhaps richer neighbors had thrown away. So Omri was very excited to open this mystery package. Inside was a small metal cupboard with a mirror inside, the kind you see over the basin in old-fashioned bathrooms. You might suppose that Omri would get another disappointment about this because the cupboard was plain and except for a shelf, it was very empty. But oddly enough, he was pleased. He loved cupboards. He liked that sort of thing. He liked keeping things inside of containers. He was not a very tidy boy in general, but he did like to arrange things in cupboards and drawers and then open them up later and find them just the way he left them. "I do wish it locked," he said. "You might thank me before you start complaining," said Gillen. "Oh, look here, it's got a keyhole," said Mother. "I've got a whole box full of keys. Why don't you try all the smaller ones and see if one of them fit?" Most of the keys were much too big, but there was half a dozen that were about the right size. All but one of those were very ordinary. The unordinary one was the most interesting key in the whole collection. Small, with a complicated lock part and a fancy top, and it had a narrow strip of red satin ribbon that looped through one of its curling openings. See what I mean? How you can just picture the key? Really great writing. Omri saved the fancy key for last. None of the others fit. And at last he picked up the curly top key and he carefully put it in the keyhole in the cupboard door, just below the knob. He did hope very much that it would turn, and he regretted wasting his birthday cake cutting wish on something so silly, or rather, so unlikely, that he might pass his spelling test the next day. And that would take real magic to bring about, as he hadn't even looked at the list yet, since he'd been given them 4 days ago. Now he closed his eyes and he unwished that he would pass the test, and he wished instead that the twisty little key would turn Gillen's present into a secret cupboard. The key turned smoothly into the lock. The door wouldn't open. "Mom, I found one." "Have you, darling? Which one?" His mother came to look. "Oh, that one. How very odd. That was the key to my grandmother's jewelry box that she got from Florence, Italy. It was made of red leather and the box fell to bits at last, but she kept the key and she gave it to me. She was terribly poor when she died. Poor old sweetie. She kept crying because she had nothing to leave me. So in the end, I said I'd rather have this little key than all the jewels in the world, and I threaded it on that bit of ribbon. It was much longer then, and it hung around my neck, and I always told her I would wear it and remember her. I did that for a long time, but then the ribbon broke and I nearly lost it." "You could have gotten a chain for it," said Omri. "You're right, I should have done that, but I didn't. But now it's your cupboard key. Please don't lose it, Omri, will you? It's a very special key to me." Omri put the cupboard on his bedside table, and opening it, he looked inside thoughtfully. What should I put in it?" "It's supposed to be for medicine," said Gillen. "You could keep your nose drops in it." "No, that's just wasting it. I haven't any other medicines." "Why don't you pop this in it?" his mother suggested, and opened her hand. And in her hand was Patrick's Indian. "I found it when I was putting your trousers in the washing machine." Omri stood carefully and placed the Indian on the shelf in the cupboard. "Are you going to shut the door?" asked his mother. "Yes, I will, and I'll lock it." He did this and kissed his mother, and then turned out the lights. He lay down on his side and looked at the cupboard, feeling very content. Just as he was dropping off to sleep, his eyes snapped open. He thought he heard a little noise. Everything's quiet, so he closed his eyes again. In the morning, there was no doubt about it. The noise actually woke him up. He lay perfectly still in the dawn light, staring at the cupboard, from which there was now coming a most extraordinary series of sounds. A pattering, a tapping, a scrambling, surely, even a high-pitched noise, well, almost like a tiny voice. To be truthful, Omri was petrified. Who wouldn't be? Undoubtedly, there was something alive in the cupboard. At last, he put out his hand and he touched it. He pulled very carefully. The door was shut tight. But as he pulled, the cupboard moved just slightly. The noise from inside instantly stopped. He lay still for a long time, wondering, had he imagined it? The noise did not start again. At last, he cautiously turned the key and opened the cupboard door. The Indian was gone. Omri sat up sharply in bed and peered into the dark corners. Suddenly, he saw him. But he wasn't on the shelf anymore. He was in the bottom of the cupboard. And he wasn't standing upright anymore. He was crouching into the darkest corner, half hidden in front of the cupboard. And he was alive. Omri knew that immediately. To begin with, though the Indian was trying to keep perfectly still as Omri had kept lying in bed a minute ago, he was breathing heavily. His bare, bronze shoulders rose and fell. They were shiny with sweat. The single feather sticking out the back of his headband quivered, and the Indian was trembling. As Omri peered closer, his breath fell on the tiny, huddled figure. He saw it jump to its feet. Its minute hand made a sudden darting move toward its belt, and it came to rest, clutching the handle of a knife smaller than the shaft of a tack. Well, wouldn't you know, I have a tack right here. See that? Neither Omri nor the Indian moved for perhaps a minute and a half. They hardly breathed either. They just stared at each other. The Indian's eyes were black and fierce and frightened. His lips were drawn back from shining white teeth, so small you could scarcely see except when they caught the light. He stood pressed against the inside of the cupboard, clutching his knife, rigid with terror but defiant. The first coherent thought that came to Omri's mind as he began to get over the shock was, I must call the others, meaning his parents and his brothers. But something, he wasn't sure, stopped him. Maybe he was afraid that if he took his eyes off the Indian for even a moment, he would vanish or become plastic again. And then when the others came running, they would all laugh and accuse Omri of making things up, and who could blame anyone for not believing this, unless they saw it with their own eyes anyways. Another reason Omri didn't call anyone was that if he was not dreaming, and the Indian had really come alive, it was certainly the most marvelous thing that had ever happened to Omri in his life, and he wanted to keep that to himself, at least at first. His next thought was that he must somehow get the Indian in his hand. He didn't want to frighten him any further, but he had to touch him. He simply had to. He reached his hand slowly into the cupboard. The Indian gave a fantastic leap into the air, his black hair flying and the fringes of his leggings fluttered. His knife raised above his hand, flashed through the air, and he gave a shout, yay, 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 yay! Even though it was a tiny shout to match his body. Nevertheless, it was loud enough to make Omri jump high, but not so much as he jumped when the little knife pierced his finger deep enough to draw some blood. Omri stuck his finger in his mouth and sucked it, and thought how gigantic he must look to the tiny Indian and how fantastically brave he had been to stab him. The Indian stood there in moccasins, planted apart on the white painted metal floor, his chest heaving, his knife held ready, and his black eyes quite wild. Omri thought he was magnificent. I won't hurt you. I only want to pick you up. The Indian opened his mouth. A stream of words spoken in loud, tiny voices came out, none of which Omri could understand. Don't you speak English? Asked Omri. All the Indians in films spoke some sort of English. It would be terrible if his Indian couldn't talk to him. Oh no. The Indian lowered his knife a fraction and he said, I speak. Omri breathed in deep relief. Oh, good. Listen, I don't know how it happened that you came to life. Perhaps it must be something to do with this cupboard or the key. Anyway, here you are, and I think you're great. And I don't mind that you stabbed me, only please, can I pick you up? After all, you are my Indian. He said all this very quickly, and the Indian was just staring at him. The knife point went down a little further, but he didn't answer. Well, can I pick you up? Please? Say something. I speak slowly, grunted the miniature Indian at last. Oh, I want to make sure you get a good picture of or a good look at this illustration too. Do you see the Indian? Oh, Omri thought. Let me pick you up. The knife came up again in an instant, and the Indian's knees bent into a crouch. No. Oh, please, said Omri. You touch, I kill, the Indian growled ferociously. You might have expected Omri to laugh at this absurd threat from a tiny creature scarcely bigger than his middle finger, armed with only a pinpoint. But Omri didn't laugh. He didn't even feel like laughing. This Indian, his Indian, was behaving in every way like a real, live, brave Indian. And despite the vast differences in their size and strength, Omri respected him, and even, odd as it sounds, he feared him at that moment. Oh, okay, I won't then, but there's no need to get angry. I don't want to hurt you. Then, as the Indian looked baffled, he said in what he supposed was Indian English, Me no hurt you. You come here, I hurt you, said Indian swiftly. Omri had been half lying in bed all this time. Now cautiously and slowly he got up. His heart was thundering in his chest. He couldn't be sure why he was being so cautious. Was it so he didn't frighten the Indian, or because he was frightened himself? Oh, he wished one of his brothers would come in, or even better yet, his father. But no one came in his bedroom. Standing in his bare feet, he took the cupboard by its top corners and turned it till it faced the window. He did this very carefully so that he wouldn't startle the Indian. He did this slowly, but nevertheless, the Indian fell. He was on his feet again in a second, and he never dropped his knife. Sorry, said Omri. The Indian responded with a snarl. Huh. There was no more conversation for the next few minutes. Omri watched at the Indian looking in the early sunlight. He was a splendid sight, just under 3 inches tall, with blue-black hair done in a plait, just like a braid, boys and girls, and pressed to his head by a colored headband, which gleamed in the sun. So did his minuscule muscles on his tiny naked torso and the skin of his arms. His legs were covered with buckskin leggings, which had some decoration on them too small to see properly. He wore a kind of bandolier across his chest, and his belt seemed to be made of several strands of some shiny white beads. Best of all, somehow, were his little moccasins. Omri found himself wondering, not for the first time recently, where his magnifying glass was. It was the only way he would ever be able to see the intricate detail of the Indian's clothes. Omri looked as closely as he dared at the Indian's face. He expected to see paint on it, war paint, but there was none. There was a turkey feather stuck in his headband that came out when the Indian had fallen, but it was now laying on the floor of the cupboard. It was about as big as the spike on a horse chestnut, but it was a real feather. So Omri suddenly asked him, "Were you always this small?" "I not small, you big," Indian said. "No," began Omri, but then he stopped. He heard his mother beginning to move about next door. The Indian heard it too. He froze. The door of the next room opened, and Omri knew any moment his mother would come in to wake him up for school. So in a flash, he bent down and whispered, "Don't worry, I'll be back." He closed and locked the cupboard door and jumped back into bed. "Omri, time to get up," his mother called. She bent down and kissed him, paying no attention to the cupboard, and she left the room again, leaving the door wide open. Boys and girls, I really hope you enjoyed the first chapter of The Indian in the Cupboard. I'll be reading a chapter a day, sometimes two, and tomorrow we'll read The Door is Shut, chapter 2. Bye.